straight from the mayor's mouth, with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Straight from the Mayor's Mouth. We're going solo this week because Mark Barnes is still away overseas, and I'm still overseas at the moment. I'm in Japan. I'll talk a little bit more about the trip to Japan later on in the episode, but for the moment I want to just mention my April Fool's Day media release, which was a lot of fun. I like to do a April Fool's Day media release each year. Come up with something that's almost believable, but clever people soon work out that it's a April Fool's Day joke. But I like to have a bit of a message in my April Fool's Day jokes as well. This particular one, which was released on Easter Monday, which I admit is not the best day to have a media release come out, talked about the idea that this year, September 14 this year, when the next council elections are being held, we will be going from 10 councillors, as we currently have, to 11 councillors. Now, this is as a result of a referendum that was held at the December 2021 elections, where the community voted to move away from the 5 wards of 2 that we currently have at council and move to just one single council area, but have 11 councillors, an odd number, and my personal preference for a prime number is important, I think, in a group of councillors. But I talked about the fact we're moving from 10 to 11, then the 11th councillor, I proposed in my media release that we would have that as an AI councillor called AIC1. And the idea was that you'd have a councillor that you could take all the emotion out of decisions. The councillor would just make a decision based on all the facts. We'd still have 10 human councillors, but an 11th councillor, which would be an AI councillor. Now, we're not planning on doing this. I have no idea or no thoughts at all that I've heard that any of the 128 councils across the state are looking to do this. In fact, the 537 councils across the nation, I've never heard of anyone wanting to do this, but I thought it was an interesting concept to throw around just to discuss, because we should as councillors have some human emotion and take into account humans in our decision making, but we've got to be careful we don't be don't be highly influenced by emotions. We need to make decisions based on the facts and based on the data, which is quite difficult to do as a human. Well done to some of the people that picked up the quotes that I gave from Professor April F. Day, where that particular professor came from the Academy for Progressive Research in Intelligent Learning, which of course spells out the acronym APRIL. Some people picked up on that. And the department the particular professor came from was the Faculty of Organisational and Operational Leadership. Again, well done to people who picked up that that acronym spelled out the word fool. Again, this is not being proposed by council, but it is an interesting concept to have maybe some part of human emotion removed from our decision-making process. But I'll look forward to see what I come up with next year. The last few I've been quite happy with the various April Fool's Day media releases I've put out. I'll be interested to see what I come up with in the one I do for next year. I haven't started planning that one yet. I normally only plan them a couple of days beforehand and see what might be relevant and might be of interest to people at the time. Now, of course, I mentioned I am in Japan at the moment. I'll talk more about that later in the episode. But one of the things now that's a little bit different to many years ago is that, of course, now you can be in contact via email, via phone, and continue on your duties, in fact, and via video conferences as well, continue on the duties. So most of my time over here I've spent doing my normal duties as mayor, get up early in the morning because Australia, Dubbo's 2 hours ahead of Japanese time. Japan's only got one time zone across the entire country, which was quite interesting and causes a few little problems across the country. But we're 2 hours behind, so typically my normal day in Japan has been up at 5 a.m, do some of the radio interviews that I normally do, say, after 7 a.m, do that for the first few hours of the day. And then we've been quite lucky in that our official delegation duties typically have only started around 9 or 9:30 a.m. Japanese time. So that's 11 a.m. obviously back home. So that gives me a chance to work from, say, 7 to 11 on various duties back home, catch up with phone calls, emails, that type of thing, and then go and attend to the official duties for the rest of the day. And those official duties typically go till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, or one night we had our karaoke evening, so that went a little bit longer than that. But it's been fantastic from that perspective. And one of the things that I've certainly been able to do is keep up to date with a variety of things that have been happening, including the fantastic news that we had some funding come through for Comobella Crossing. Now, people that are paying attention or listening intently to what's happening at council would be very familiar with this, because there's been a bit of debate with councillors around this particular crossing. Now, this is the one that's on Saxa Road. Saxa Road is the road that joins the Golden Highway across to the Mitchell Highway, used by regional traffic and local traffic. It's also often called the Comobella Crossing, and sometimes people refer to it as a crossing across Mitchell Creek. But this has been one that's been a problem for many years now. It's in the old Wellington Shire Council, and this particular crossing at the moment is a culvert. But Mitchell Creek doesn't need a lot of rain to fall for that to get to the stage where water's going across that culvert, and often gets to the stage pretty quickly where it's too deep for vehicles, and then it gets to the stage where it's too deep for four-wheel drives to get across that particular culvert. With all the rain we had during the last half of 2022, that culvert has been severely damaged, and it's been very limited in traffic. In fact, we've limited it back to local traffic essentially across that particular crossing. Now, a lot of the debate on council was whether we should replace that culvert with another culvert. We often can get flood repair funding from the state government to do like-for-like replacement, or another train of thought from councillors that we should really put a decent bridge in for this particular crossing for a couple of reasons. One, we just feel like if we continue to replace that with another culvert, then you still have the same problems with flooding, and probably another 5 or 10 years' time we'd be spending more money on fixing up that same culvert. So it seemed like not a good long-term solution to basically replace it with a culvert. We also had a bit of an issue with fisheries. We've got to get permission from fisheries when we're doing work in waterways, and certainly fisheries were not keen for a culvert to be put back there in place of the existing culvert for a whole range of reasons that I won't bore you with at the moment. So a bridge was really the right way to go, and that was the majority of councillors. But again, as is the way in a democracy, there was lots of debate about this particular item. With lots of items, there's lots of good, solid debate. And again, some councillors believe we shouldn't be applying for money or after money from other levels of government. We should just do a like-for-like replacement. Luckily, the logical conclusion that councillors had in the end, the resolution from council, was that we'd go ahead and replace that bridge, or replace that culvert, with a bridge. And we actually had applications in for funding. And during the week, we were successful. The federal government announced that we would receive $2.779322 million for that, or in round numbers, let's call it $2.8 million. We estimate that it'll probably be in the vicinity of $3.2 million for that project. So there is a little bit of money that we're still chasing from the state government. It might end up costing us nothing. It might end up costing us a little bit of money. But even if it does cost us a little bit of money, I think to get a bridge in place there on that particular crossing, it's well and truly worth it for our residents, and worth it from a regional road perspective. And that's where that classification as a regional road makes sense, that other levels of government pay for that. But that was fantastic news, very happy with that, and very happy with the fact that councillors made that decision to continue down that path to put a bridge in place. Now, we think the bridge that we'll put there will take some time, and I'll give more information in future podcasts, but I would suggest that probably somewhere in the vicinity of April next year before we see that particular bridge finished. Yes, I'd love to have it up and running before that, but the reality is the design and construction of that bridge will take some time. So probably around April next year before we see that in place. Now, keen viewers of the airport will notice some exercises that are happening over the airport over the next 2 weeks. That'll start on the 8th of April, and we've got 16 trainee pilots from the Royal Australian Air Force that are doing an exercise called Exercise Redry Sunrise. These are pilots that are doing some intermediate pilots flying training course. So you'll see some Pilatus PC-21 aircraft from the RAF base at East Sale, and they'll arrive on Sunday afternoon, Sunday the 7th of April, and then flying will occur up till the 20th of April. So obviously all the normal things that you'd expect. There'll be variables such as air traffic control requirements, the weather, and operational availability, so you may not see them all the time, but keep an eye in the air for some of these trainee pilots that are around Dubbo. Pretty interesting for people that are interested in planes and seeing what planes we've got flying over Dubbo over the next couple of weeks. Now again, as I mentioned, I've been keeping up to date with what's happening at home. I have regular phone calls with the staff at home and regular communications. Actually, I remember way back, it was probably 2005. I'm going from memory there. I was deputy mayor at the time, and I remember Alan Smith was the mayor. And Alan Smith came for a visit to Japan. He was visiting our sister city, Minokamo, at the time. And I remember at an official level, I became the mayor for the 2 weeks while Alan was away. And there's a process that you go through to make all of that happen. But the idea then was the mayor was out of contact, so the deputy mayor stepped in and became the mayor. And I remember being told at the time, and it was emphasised, that there's no such thing as a stand-in mayor or acting mayor. Either you're the mayor or not the mayor. So on a technicality, I was the mayor in 2005 or thereabouts for a 2-week time frame. Now it's a little bit different. Now it's so easy with mobile phones that are able to roam, with email that are able to be accessed. I know with Wi-Fi, you can access Wi-Fi everywhere. In fact, I carry a dongle with me that I use on those occasions. So it's certainly a little bit different now. So I've continued on with my normal duties. But I have seen some reports in the local media and had some discussions with our staff around this in relation to the local media running a story. It might have been generated from a Facebook page initially, that some young children in Dubbo were having skin irritations, and they were citing that the drinking water supply was the cause of the irritation. So we actually tested the water at these particular properties where the story was discussed, and as you would hope is the case, the water at those particular properties conformed with the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. This is a very serious thing. We need to produce water that is in line with the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. We must do that, and we test that on a constant basis at the water treatment plant, and then we'll also test it around the community. And in this particular case, that's exactly what we did. Now, in the article from the Daily Liberal, it said that Professor Stuart Kahn, who was head of the School of Civil Engineering at the University of Sydney, says it was possible that water from a tap, even a tap that sits within the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines, could cause skin irritations. However, he said the cases in which this had been proven were few, and often the skin irritation was caused by an allergic reaction to something else in the environment. So we continually monitor that, and we're quite comfortable that it fits within the guidelines that we have to do. But when that article was run in the Daily Liberal, another customer actually logged a customer request in relation to skin irritation. So we tested their water as well, and this also met the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. So I'm very comfortable and very confident that the water that we're producing does fit under those guidelines. And you may remember, it was probably a year ago, maybe more than that, that we did have a boil water alert, and that was due to the turbidity of the water going above 0.5. Now, this is the way this council will operate. If we do know of something where it's not sitting under the guidelines or there is any issue with the water, we'll inform the community immediately so that you know about that, and we'll take the appropriate actions. In this case, there is no suggestion at all that there is anything that we can find in our water that would be causing any skin irritation. Now, one issue in relation to water that we do know was a problem was the water restrictions that we had during the week in Wellington. Now, this was a different issue altogether. There was no question about the quality of the water itself. What we did do is we stopped treating the water in Wellington for a short period of time. Now, this was because we actually ran out of a chemical, which sounds a bit embarrassing, but I'll get into more detail on that, ran out of a chemical that was used, or that is used, in the treatment of water. We've got various sensors that monitor the level of our various chemicals. If you've ever been into the control room of one of our water treatment plants, then there's a whole range of monitoring that occurs there that's relying on sensors to basically make sure we've got all the chemicals in place and they're all being put into the water in the right way. In this particular case, there was a chemical that we ran out of because the sensor in this case wasn't able to or didn't report that we're running low on that particular chemical. We've got reservoirs in place across all of our water network, but including Wellington. So we basically use the water from those reservoirs. We asked the residents of Wellington to restrict their water supply or the water usage, and that was done so that we could actually get to the point where we had enough water to be able to keep delivering to the community. So once we had that supply again, and polyaluminium chloride was the particular chemical in question here. Once we reordered that, obviously urgently ordered that, that arrived at approximately 11:45 a.m. on Thursday morning. That could then start being put back into the water. We were producing water by approximately 2 p.m. on Thursday. That was starting to be sent out to the distribution or out to the network by 3 p.m. And so basically by the next morning, by the Friday morning, the reservoirs are back up to where they needed to be. So thank you to all the people in the Wellington community who did restrict their water usage. That allowed us to make sure we had enough water pressure to continue on. And that was really the main issue here. It was nothing about the quality of the water. It was all about the actual amount. So the amount of water we had in those reservoirs would affect the water pressure. Obviously the pressure you get at the tap is a result of the height of the water above the tap. So the amount of pressure that's above that tap, as that reservoir or as those reservoir levels fell, that would reduce the water pressure. So by people restricting their water usage, it kept enough pressure for you to basically do the essential items. So we asked people to not use the water for non-essential items, so things like watering gardens, but obviously you could still have a shower and drink water. So that worked out well. Thank you to the people of Wellington who did the right thing there and restricted that water usage, and the reservoirs are back up and running by Friday morning. And again, we were out there very open to make sure people in the community knew exactly what was happening. Now, I mentioned last week there was some discussion around the sale yards, and I'll stress again, I stressed it last week, but I'll stress it again. Councillors have made no decision about the future of the sale yards except to say that some things need to change out there. There's been a range of changes in legislation, a range of investigations that we've undertaken with some discussion with the Office of Local Government and with our legal team. And the operating model there is not the ideal operating model for a council-owned asset. So there'll be some changes there. When we're investigating all the different processes we've got in place in terms of how our businesses run, our various businesses run, then it's incumbent upon us as councillors to make sure that we do look at the best possible way to run a business. Now, we've got a lot of businesses, and I often talk about the fact that a regional council seems to have a lot more on its plate than some Sydney-based councils. So, for example, in Dubbo, we've got our airport, Dubbo Regional Airport, we've got Rainbow Childcare Centre, we've got the NRMA Dubbo Holiday Park, we've got the Old Dubbo Jail as a tourist attraction, we've got the Wellington Caves as a tourist attraction, we've got the Aquatic Leisure Centres, John Gilbert Water Treatment Plant, the Dubbo Sewerage Treatment Plant, and the Dubbo Regional Livestock Markets. So we've got a whole range of different assets there. We need to make sure we're always looking at the best way to run those. Now, sometimes we might make some money out of some of those assets. Sometimes we might lose money. There might be a community contribution. Whether we're making money or losing money, we should be trying to make them perform at the absolute best we possibly can. Now, council have been looking at this for some time. We had a tour out at the sale yards last year. I've been out at the sale yards many times. I actually find it quite fascinating watching sheep sales in particular. I find that a fascinating process to watch that. So we had a number of meetings about that and some workshops to discuss the sale yards. And what we've done now is we've resolved to go to an expression of interest process to look at the potential sale or potential lease of the sale yards, but that doesn't mean we've got to do either of those. We can also continue to run them as council, but we would have to change that business model. They aren't great for council from a pure money-making venture. And if I look at the last year's financial statement, for example, you had income around the amount of 3.44 million. We had the cost to council of around about $5.15 million, which included depreciation. So we're not running an asset that's making a huge amount of money On a cash flow basis, they return some money to council, but depreciation and the ongoing upgrade of the infrastructure is somewhat problematic. And again, if you consider all of that in the whole process, they aren't a great money-making venture. They do bring money to the Dubbo community. That's something we've got to consider as councillors as well. If we run it ourselves, or if we leased it out, long-term leased it out, if we sold them off, then the sale yard would still be operating. They'd still be generating money for the Dubbo community when sales are run. But it doesn't mean necessarily that the council has to own them for that to be the case. But again, no decision has been made, so we'll continue to look at the different options. We'll continue to talk to the various organisations involved, whether it be the agents, whether it be the farmers, whether it be the carriers. We'll continue to consider all of that. As we do with all of our businesses, we've got to consider all these different aspects of it. But I know some councils have been getting some phone calls, which is fine, and I encourage people in the community to make phone calls, send emails off, and just consider the whole equation of it there. We have to make sure that's exactly what we do. Consider the entire equation, not just one part of the equation. Now we're doing some sewage rehab work at the moment. We've got approximately 700 kilometres of sewage pipes across Dubbo and Wellington. And some of these pipes, some of these mains in particular, are almost 100 years old. So they need some work to remain functional. And we also want to make sure we improve their operating efficiency. What would be lovely to do would be to dig them up, pull them out and replace them with new pipes. That makes it hard to maintain the overall process of sewage treatment occurring in all those different mains, but also it's a very expensive way. So we're actually utilising a relining technique rather than just excavating and replacing them. So this is a fairly new rehab process, and again it'll allow those pipes to be used, but it's also very cost effective in what we're doing there. So we'll basically be relining that. We should see very little impact on residents, very little impact on the sewage treatment process. So hopefully people don't notice too many things happening that are causing any problems there. We'll let you know if there's anything where you've got to make some changes or restrict some access. But essentially you'll notice some work being done there. And again, it's just good to keep people up to date with what's happening. We think that these works will be completed by around about August this year. Now this isn't a council project, but I wanted to give residents an update on the PCYC Sports Hub. You may remember announcements before the last election about significant funds. There was already some funds that were being given to the PCYC for this sports hub. That was before, several years before the election, and then before the election there was additional funds that were dedicated towards this project, and I want to give residents an update. So the Sports Hub, if you like, or the official name is the PCYC Dubbo Regional Indoor Sports Centre. There's been tenders to design and construct stage 1 of this. Those tenders closed in March, and those tenders are currently being assessed, obviously not by council. This will be done by Public Works, again as a state government project. The tenders are fairly complicated. They're going to take approximately 12 weeks to complete the tender process, or the tender assessment process. The successful tenderer should be announced by July, and then construction hopefully will commence shortly after that. So probably August, for example, and then the whole PCYC Sports Hub Stage 1 should be completed by early 2026. Now this sports centre will include 5 courts for basketball, netball, etc., gymnastics, there'll be some administration area for PCYC, reception area, a kitchen, a youth hub, some area there for police to engage with some of the youth. There'll be multi-purpose area, lockers, a boxing gym, fitness gym, toilet, storage areas. So it'll be a pretty comprehensive area there. And there's also some work being done on the master plan for this whole area. And again, there's been talk about different areas, whether it be tennis or rugby, a whole range of different potential areas that will be there. But essentially by the beginning of 2026, we should see stage 1 completed out there, which is very exciting. I mentioned before that I'm delivering this podcast from Japan at the moment, and I'll talk a little bit about Japan and what's happening there and things that we've done, but I'll go through a bit of the history as well. We've got 12 delegates that have just finished the tour of Japan, of Minokamo, our sister city in Japan. But I'll go through and just give a little bit about the history and just some of the background for this. I need to stress again, and I have every time I've talked about this, that this is a self-funded trip. We've got the 12 delegates on this trip. Now these delegates comprise councillors, so we've got 3 councillors on this particular trip, Councillor Shibli Chowdhury, Councillor Matt Wright and myself. We've got members, or one member of the Sister City Committee. We've got previous chaperones on this particular trip, that's student chaperones. We've got previous students on this trip that have been on exchanges with Minokamo here in Japan. So there's a range of different people. And again, I can't stress enough how good it is that these residents and councillors are undertaking this trip, representing Dubbo, being there as an official delegation, but they're paying for their airfares, they're paying for their accommodation. They're not being paid for by Dubbo Regional Council. And I've seen many comments on social media talking about a waste of taxpayer funds or a waste of ratepayers' money. And again, I keep stressing, this is funded by all those individuals, which I think is a significant thing that these individuals are doing at their own cost. Again, they're representing Dubbo on this city trip, and they're paying for their airfares, they're paying for their accommodation themselves. Now we do have, of course, a sister city officer, and for many years that was Kylie Sutherland, and it's now Daisy Wang. And again, that's fantastic that we've got this person who's responsible for all these things, but Daisy only works 2 days a week, and the same as Kylie, when she worked, she was a permanent part-time employee of council. So it's not as if we've got a huge amount of money being spent on someone there that's working all day, every day of the week. And I compare that to Minokamo, and they've got several employees that's their full-time job, is to look after sister city relations, and they've got a fair bit of emphasis on that. But again, what we have, I think, what we have as a result, which I'll talk about in a moment, a result of our sister city relationship is quite significant. So the fact that we've got one person 2 days a week employed to do that is quite efficient in terms of the use of that particular person's time. Now, Daisy is with us on this trip, and this has been mentioned in our media release, there's no secrets here. As an employee of council, yes, council paid for Daisy to come on this trip, which I think is reasonable and fair. It would be very hard to ask an employee of any organisation to go on a trip overseas and fund that themselves. It's not compulsory for Daisy to come on the trip, but as a new member of council, I think it's important that she does come along. I have been on previous delegations where certainly Kylie didn't come on the trip, so it wasn't essential they came on every trip. But have I mentioned it already? This is a self-funded trip by all the people on this trip, by the other residents and councillors on this particular trip. So I'll go through a bit of history from Minokamo and our sister city relationship. Minokamo itself was declared a city on the 1st of April 1954. That wasn't an April Fool's Day joke. The fact that the financial year in Japan typically starts on the 1st of April is why that particular date was chosen. So this year it's the 70th anniversary of the declaration of Minokamo as a city. Back in June 1989, the sister city relationship between Dubbo and Minokamo was signed. Tom Slattery would have been the mayor back in 1989. He would have signed that relationship with the mayor of Minokamo at the time. So this year marks the 35th anniversary of that particular relationship, and I think it's been a wonderful relationship. One of the things I think that's great from a cultural perspective is sharing cultural ideas, sharing culture in general. But I also think if we look at it at a very much a big picture level, if we have sister city relationships with other cities around the world, if there's lots of these relationships, which there are around the world, then I think it helps the world be a closer place. And we've had some dreadful wars, world wars across the last century. We've had some terrible wars, Korean War, Vietnam War, and we look now at the Ukrainian-Russia war. There are still wars that occur across the world. And again, I think if we all experience each other's culture and learn about other nations, we're much less likely to have wars with other nations. Now that's at a very big picture level. At an individual level, I look at some of the things that we've got in Dubbo that help mark the fact that we've got this relationship. And we have the Shoyuan Japanese garden in Dubbo, and that includes the durian ceremonial tea house. That was all opened back in November 2002. That durian ceremonial tea house was a present from Minokamo to Dubbo. What a wonderful gift that was. Now, I've met the person, a person by the name of Yoshi Itazu, a very interesting and colourful gentleman. His building company called Awa Company prefabricated that Japanese tea house in Japan, in Minokamo, and then with some of the craftsmen, so 5 craftsmen came to Dubbo, they assembled that, and it was basically built and then put into 3 12-metre shipping containers, sent to Dubbo, and those 5 craftsmen came to Dubbo and assembled that over about 12 days. So talk about that being genuine. It is 100% Japanese, and again, we didn't pay Minokamo for that. That was a present from Minokamo. Then you look at that whole Shoyuan Japanese gardens. That garden area was designed by 7 students from the Kamo Agricultural and Forestry High School and their teacher. So that was all designed again in Japan by Minokamo, and that design was then done by Dubbo, back in the day, Dubbo City Council, that whole area there. Now that area is wonderful. We get a huge amount of visitors that go there. They want to see a genuine Japanese tea house. They want to see a genuine Japanese garden. It's a fantastic area for Dubbo, and again, what a wonderful gift from Minokamo. There have been, well, I've certainly witnessed myself, weddings there. I've witnessed funerals there. I've witnessed different celebrations there. It is a wonderful area and a wonderful asset there in Elizabeth Park for Dubbo and that whole area there. So we talk about what we might achieve out of a relationship, apart from the big picture things I talked about in terms of making the world a more peaceful place. Having that particular garden there, having that tea house there, I think is a wonderful thing for us as a community to have another tourist attraction there, without a doubt. We also have official delegations that go in both directions, but the student exchange is one of the things that I love. Each year we have 10 students from Dubbo go across to Minokamo, and we have 2 chaperones go across from Dubbo to visit Minokamo. Now we do make a contribution to their costs. From memory, it's about $1,000 per student that we contribute and $1,000 per chaperone, but the students and the chaperones have to put in the rest of the money to go and visit Minokamo. The same happens on the opposite way. There are students that come across from Minokamo each year, again chaperones that come across. Unfortunately, during COVID, that stopped for several years, but last year, 2023, those exchanges started up again. So we had a visit from a student delegation from Minokamo, and we also had students go from Dubbo across. So I think that's fantastic that we've got that ongoing exchange that happens, and again, it just strengthens that relationship. I know there are lifelong friendships that have been created out of that, because typically you've got home hosting, so you'll have the students come across. I've certainly had a student from one of those exchanges stay at our place, and the students go across in the other direction. And I've had 2 of my children who have gone across on those exchanges. Now I want to point out here, in case people think there's some nepotism happening there, when I was mayor up to before 2016, 12th of May 2016, when the amalgamation occurred, I had students, some of my, sorry, not students, some of my children, 2 of my children, my 2 eldest children, were at the age that those student exchanges would have been applicable. I didn't let them apply because I thought that would have been seen as nepotism, that my children were gaining an advantage out of being the mayor's daughter, in this case the mayor's 2 daughters. So we said to the students, as wonderful as it would have been to apply to go across on those, I didn't think it was right as the mayor for my children to be applying for those. After I was no longer mayor, after the amalgamation, then my next child that came along that was at the right age to apply for that student exchange, my son did apply, and that was in 2017, and was successful in his application and went across on one of those student exchanges. And then again in 2019, I was no longer on council at that stage, for the 2017 and 2019 student exchanges. I wasn't on council, wasn't mayor, so my youngest daughter then applied to go across, and she went across on a student exchange as well. So I've had two of my children be involved as part of those student exchanges. Again, can't stress enough, I wasn't on council at the time, so there was no influence that I had on council. They went through the normal process to apply. So fast forward to 2013, we had a new entrance created there for the Shoryuan Gardens, and the entrance there was crafted by Japanese craftsmen. I do remember quite well being involved in that in a little way, where I got to get up and do some of the work on that for about 10 minutes, so I didn't really do much work on there, but it certainly was a part of that new entrance that we've got there. And again, that was one of those things to keep adding to that. So that was 2013 that was added there. And then I've also been fortunate enough to be a part of, well, this is my fourth trip to Japan. Back in 2013, I first visited Minokamo as our sister city, and that was a part of an official delegation there. And we had some councillors along that trip and some people from Dubbo, from the community. And I also brought along my wife and 4 children on that particular trip. Now again, I've mentioned it before, our policy is that we don't pay for international travel or international accommodation for our councillors. So I went along on that trip, self-funded. I paid for our children to come along on that particular trip. But the Japanese delegation at the time, or the Japanese people that received us, were thrilled that we thought enough of Minokamo to bring along our children and bring along my wife for that particular trip. So that was my first visit to Japan, my first visit to Minokamo. I then visited again in November the next year, again self-funded. This was a part of their Diamond Jubilee celebrations. They were celebrating their 60th anniversary of their city. It was a major celebration. It was a very quick trip that I came over in November 2014. If I had to think about it, I'd probably say it was maybe 6 days I was here in Japan, maybe not even that. It was a very quick trip. I didn't bring my wife and children over on that particular one. I paid for it myself, came over. I was a part of their celebrations as a significant member of their community in terms of the sister-city relationship then. And so again, it was a part of that. I actually then came to Japan in December 2023 as the leader of a CLAIR, C-L-A-I-R, delegation of Australian Council. So it wasn't specifically a Dubbo trip, but a CLAIR delegation. Now on that particular trip, I paid for my flights to Japan, but CLAIR did cover the cost of the accommodation while I was in Japan leading that delegation. And we went to a place called Kahuku Town. And again, that idea was to share ideas between councils in Australia and councils, actually Australia and New Zealand. We had some representatives from New Zealand and then the councils in Japan. So again, this is my fourth particular trip, and I've got my wife and 2 of my children, the 2 that were a part of those delegations that I mentioned before on that trip, and there's 12 delegates on this particular trip at the moment. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the background and some of the delegations we've been on before. But again, I think very important that it's stressed that these are self-funded trips. I'm paying out of my own pocket for airfares and accommodation on this particular trip, as all the members, apart from our 1 staff member, as all the members of the delegation are doing. I've been doing my best while on this trip to keep updates on social media, to let people know what we've been doing and the various places we've been visiting as we've been going around. So I'll give you a quick rundown in terms of what's been occurring on this particular trip. We flew from South Korea into Nagoya, and then we were picked up by Minokamo Council from Nagoya and taken across. The first visit was a brewery, which is an interesting place to visit first, but what I did find amusing about that particular trip is that that brewery was the former council building. Now, some people will suggest that maybe that's a great place to have a brewery in the council building, but of course it's not the brewery, it's not a council building anymore, sorry, it's a dedicated brewery. But the person running that particular brewery, the owner if you like, or the manager of that brewery, is the grandson of the first ever mayor of Minokamo. So there is a link there to the council, to the old building, the old council building there. But the delegates did find it fascinating looking at some local manufacturing. We don't have a lot of manufacturing in Dubbo, or in Australia in fact, so it's interesting to look at some of that local manufacturing. We then, the next day, that was in the afternoon, we arrived there. Then on the Wednesday, we went and visited the Yamazaki Mazak Museum of Machine Tools. Now, I've been to Mazak before. Mazak is a place that manufactures a whole range of parts for different machines. But I haven't seen this particular museum before. It's opened since I was last here in Minokamo, and they've created an underground museum of some of the machines that they've been involved with, but other machines that they necessarily haven't been involved with. But I found the underground part of it quite fascinating. They told me that they had this as a factory previously, a manufacturing facility previously, and they had it underground because it's easier to keep it clean underground. So with the manufacturing process, trying to keep it as clean as possible. It's better for temperature control because you get a wide variety of temperatures in Minokamo. Similar to Dubbo, we get a bit hotter than Minokamo gets, and we don't get quite as cold as Minokamo gets. But they've got some fairly extreme temperatures, but also with earth tremors, it's apparently easier to keep that facility safe when it's underground there. But that was a fascinating facility, and anyone that does come to Minokamo, I'd encourage them to go and visit that. They've got a facility above ground, somewhat like the Louvre, where you've got a pyramid structure above the ground, which you then enter into and then go below ground to have a look around. But the delegates found that quite fascinating, and there is some manufacturing that occurs there as well. We then moved on to the Shogun Temple Junior College. And I've been to some temples before in Japan, but this one is a training area for people who want to learn some of the ideas of Buddhism, not necessarily become a Buddhist, but some of the ideas of Buddhism and learn and train for some of that. One of the things I found fascinating at one of the temples that I visited once before was this whole idea of learning to be so calm that you think about nothing. Now, if you think that you're thinking about nothing, that's not thinking about nothing. That's thinking about nothing. So this idea of clearing your mind to the point of not thinking about anything sounds quite fascinating to me, and my mind always seems to be thinking about something, some next part of council, some other idea, a whole range of things that you might be thinking about, but that's not counted. You need to be able to think about nothing. So that's quite fascinating. We then had we were planning on doing this outdoors, but unfortunately there was some rain, so we had to move it indoors. And this is called a Japanese traditional music and fun entertainment show, or a cultural exchange if you like. Now in doing that, it was quite interesting because they asked us to present some cultural concepts or exchange at the particular show. Now the show was typically in Japanese, but there was lots of music involved there. So some of our delegates did some piano playing for the show, did some guitar playing, singing some songs, and of course I couldn't help myself, I performed some poetry for them as well. Now it might be difficult to understand the poetry because it is in English, but the grasp of some basic concepts of English, and also the particular poem I did, Man from Ironbark, has got a fair few actions in there, so the delegates got a vague understanding of what was happening in that, but again it's a good way to exchange some of that culture and different cultures there. And then on the Wednesday night, we had the official welcome reception with the mayor. I've met the mayor before, both in Dubbo and in Minokamo, so it was good to catch up with the mayor. And it does feel like you're catching up with old friends when you walk into some of these particular functions, because you've got different people there you've dealt with over the years on an irregular basis. But it is nice to catch up with some old friends there. And the mayor pulled out a whip that I'd given him previously on a previous visit to Dubbo, so he was showing off his whip cracking skills. But again, a wonderful environment. And we had at that particular dinner other councillors. We had the vice mayor, and the vice mayor is appointed by the mayor rather than elected like we do in the system that we have in New South Wales. And we also had a member of the Gifu Parliament. So Gifu is like the prefecture, which is similar to our state, so probably the equivalent of our state member, similar to that. And we also had various members of MIA, which is the Minokamo International Exchange Association. So a bit like our sister city committee, MIA is a slightly separate organisation. And of course then we had the compulsory karaoke, which is one of my great weaknesses because I can't sing very well. But again, when in Japan, you've got to fit in with the culture there, and karaoke is very much a part of the culture. They're busy days, as I mentioned before. My normal day would start at 5 a.m. working on some things back home. And then the delegation would start about 9:30 a.m. So the next day we then went to a neighbouring LGA called Siki, and there was a sword cutlery museum and shops there, and also some demonstrations of some ancient sword smithing techniques and some swordsmanship. So we saw some swordsmanship there as well. Then we went on to a museum, which again, one of the major features of the museum, which I found fascinating, was a rhinoceros there. And at that particular museum, we also had the chance to do some calligraphy and get taught some calligraphy skills by one of the teachers there. So again, you're learning about some of the culture and sharing that across the actual delegation. We then moved on to the Dubbo International Medical Centre. Now I met there Dr. Yamada, who is the vice chair of this organisation. Back in 2013, I met Dr. Yamada, who is this Dr. Yamada's father, and he was working on then a new hospital and working in terms of the way they would build this new private hospital he was discussing at the time. But he was also involved in MIA. From memory, he was probably the chairman of MIA at the time, but there was a very close relationship with Dr. Yamada and Dubbo back when I first met the chairman in 2013. So it was nice to talk to his son and catch up with his son, and we went for a tour of the hospital. This is the new hospital that the original Dr. Yamada that I met 11 years ago was talking about building, a very impressive facility for a private hospital. One of the things in this particular hospital was a proton therapy centre, which is used to treat different types of cancers. And this is very targeted, very specific. This particular technology only exists in 2 locations in the world at the moment, here in Minokamo and in the US of A. So this was a wonderful, I thought, bit of technology, and it's only just recently been opened. This hospital's only recently been opened, but this particular technology only very recently opened here in Minokamo in terms of this targeted radiation treatment. We then got a chance to go to the Riverport Park. Now again, if I go back to those previous trips that I'd made to Minokamo in 2013 and 2014, one of the things that they talked about was they wanted something in Minokamo to represent the wonderful relationship between Minokamo and Dubbo. And offhand, I said that the best way to represent something that you wanted in the community, the same as we've got the Japanese tea house, then I said a barbecue is the obvious way that you would represent something in Minokamo, representing something about Dubbo or about Australia in general. And what we've now got, and this was the visit that was here, is a barbecue, an area to cook barbecue with a plaque on the side that talks about that particular barbecue area. And then an area that's a little red road that is called Dubbo Road, and again red to represent the red clay that we have in Dubbo, and some kangaroo statues. And these were done by Brett Garling from Wongarbin, and there was a delegation that came across in 2019 that had former Mayor Ben Shields, former councillors Dane Gumley and Greg Moore, and former CEO Michael McMahon. So they all came over in 2019 as a part of the 30th anniversary and officially opened the kangaroos or unveiled the kangaroos there on Dubbo Road. So it's wonderful to see that we've now got somewhere in Minokamo that people can see and associate directly with Dubbo, with the sister city in Dubbo. Then we got to Friday morning, went to the Waco confectionery factory, and the delegation found it quite fascinating watching the manufacturing process, watching the production of some of the sweets in there. And again, I think that's mainly because there is a lack of manufacturing in Australia. I think our wage structure is very high, which makes it hard for manufacturing to occur in Australia. So I think the delegates found it quite fascinating watching this manufacturing process there. We then moved to Mino City, which is a very traditional Japanese area, and we saw very old traditional Japanese houses, all made from timber. It looked like a scary concept if any fire ever broke out in that area, because the timbers there looked like they would burn very quickly. They've got some modern techniques to try and combat that as well. And then we went to the Mino City Washi Paper Museum and Crafts, and we had a go at making some paper with the traditional method of making paper. Now this is very similar to what we'd experienced in South Korea as well. And then the Friday night we had the traditional dinner, if you like, with the MIA members, with the Minokamo International Exchange Association members. So that was a wonderful dinner on the Friday night, and then followed up by Saturday, the final farewell. Again, I think a wonderful experience. The delegation, I think, saw a whole range of wonderful things from an economic perspective, from a cultural perspective, but there was a lot of discussion during the trip and other meetings that I had with the mayor about just continuing this wonderful cultural exchange that we've been able to create so far, and we want to continue that in the strongest possible fashion. Now, no podcast will be complete, of course, without the Limerick of the week. And, of course, I've been involved in Japan over the last week, involved with Minokamo over the last week, so it's pretty hard to go past our relationship with Minokamo for the Limerick for this week. So here we go. With a handshake and smile so wide, Dubbo's kinship we cannot hide. In Minokamo's grace we find our embrace. In this cultural exchange we take pride. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Straight from the Mayor's Mouth. Thank you to Minokamo for hosting us over the last week. It has been a wonderful trip, a wonderful visit, and we want to continue to build on this relationship, this 35-year relationship that we have with delegations going in both directions and with students going in both directions. Again, can't stress enough, a self-funded trip. Not sure if I've mentioned that through the podcast, but as many times as I've mentioned, I still have seen people commenting about the waste of taxpayer funds, and also people commenting on why is a delegation here in Minokamo? Why do we have councils in Minokamo when we've got crime to fix in Dubbo? And again, I've talked about it before, that council's not responsible for crime. The state government with policing and with sentencing laws is the government level responsible for solving crime issues. Not to say that we don't want council to contribute where we can, but again, we've got to do what we can do in the areas of responsibility that we have. But I'm not sure what I'd be doing in Dubbo that would be solving crime. I haven't got a cape I can put on. I can't go and start a vigilante group. We've got agencies that are responsible for that. Fixing potholes, doing work on the community in Dubbo, that all continues on. We've got over 500 staff at council doing that, but again, I'll still be continuing on my normal duties as the councillors have as well that have been on this trip. So I think this is a really important part of all the different parts, the facets of council we've got, and we're continuing to work on all those different facets. So thank you for the feedback from the community. Thank you for the various discussions I've had with community members over the last week. But I think this is a really important part of what we've got, and continuing on this cultural exchange is an important part of that. I'll talk to you again next week. I'll be back in Dubbo in a couple of days' time. I'll talk to you again next week on Straight from the Mayor's Mouth.
Straight from the Mayor's Mouth with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.